What if one man's arrogance cost his nation everything? What if the greatest military machine the modern world had ever seen was brought to ruin, not by its enemies alone, but by the very man who created it? Adolf Hitler rose from a failed Austrian art student to the undisputed dictator of a continental empire, commanding millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and an air force that shook the world. In the early years of the war, it seemed as though nothing could stop him. Poland fell in weeks. France, which had resisted Germany for 4 brutal years in the First World War, collapsed in just 6 weeks in 1940. The Wehrmacht rolled through the Low Countries, swept into the Balkans, and drove deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. Hitler stood at the pinnacle of power, master of an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the suburbs of Moscow, from the frozen fjords of Norway to the sands of North Africa. And yet, within 5 years, it was all gone. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies shattered, its people starving, its Führer dead by his own hand in a concrete bunker beneath a burning Berlin. How did it come to this? The answer, historians have concluded again and again, lies not merely in the strength of the Allies, not merely in the industrial might of the United States, or the sheer human endurance of the Soviet Union, but in a series of catastrophic, self-inflicted decisions made by Hitler himself. These were not minor missteps or simple bad luck. They were monumental strategic blunders, moments when Hitler overruled his generals, ignored military logic, and allowed his obsessions and his ideology to override any rational calculation of risk and reward. In this video, we're going to walk through the most consequential of those blunders, one by one, and examine exactly how and why each one brought the Third Reich closer to its inevitable destruction. We will see how a man who prided himself on his military genius proved time and again to be his own worst enemy. So without further ado, let us start with the very first great mistake that, in retrospect, may well have changed the entire course of the Second World War. In the spring of 1940, Hitler had achieved something that even the most optimistic German war planner would scarcely have dared to dream. The Wehrmacht had torn through France and the Low Countries with breathtaking speed, and by late May, the entire Allied expeditionary force in northern France, consisting of roughly 338,000 British, French and Belgian soldiers, had been driven back to the English Channel. They were trapped on the beaches and in the port town of Dunkirk, with their backs to the sea and German armoured columns closing in from all sides. This was the single greatest opportunity Hitler would ever have to knock Britain out of the war in one decisive blow. If those men were captured or destroyed, Britain would have had no army left to fight. The pressure to seek peace would have been overwhelming. Winston Churchill, who had only just become Prime Minister on May 10th, might well have been swept from power before he could rally the nation. The war might have ended then and there with Germany, the master of Europe, and then Hitler gave the order to halt. On May 24th, 1940, Hitler personally issued the infamous halt order, instructing his panzer commanders to stop their advance and hold position outside Dunkirk. The decision sent shockwaves through the German High Command. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant armoured commander whose panzers had spearheaded the breakthrough through the Ardennes, was furious. His tanks were close enough to see the sea. He had been given the chance to envelop and destroy the entire Allied army in a single sweeping movement, and now he was being told to stop. General Erich von Manstein, the operational architect of the entire French campaign, was equally stunned. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, under whose command the armoured forces operated, had suggested a pause partly to allow the infantry to catch up and consolidate, but Hitler transformed this tactical hesitation into a full stop that lasted for 2.5 crucial days, from May 24th until the morning of May 26th, by which time the British had begun their miraculous evacuation. The reasons Hitler gave were a combination of the practical and the delusional. He worried that the marshy ground around Dunkirk would bog down his precious tanks, which he wanted to preserve for a final sweep south against the remaining French forces. He also, extraordinarily, expressed a belief that the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring could finish the job from the air, a catastrophically misplaced confidence in the capabilities of his air force. Göring had enthusiastically assured Hitler that his bombers could seal the trap, but the Luftwaffe was operating at the extreme limit of its range. The weather over the Channel was frequently poor, and the Royal Air Force fought with ferocious determination to protect the evacuation fleet. Over the 9 days of Operation Dynamo, between May 26th and June 4th, the British managed to evacuate 338,000 men, a number that Churchill himself called a miracle, though he was careful to warn that evacuations do not win wars. What makes this blunder so extraordinary is that Hitler, in some accounts, may have allowed the escape deliberately. There are historians who have argued that Hitler harboured a lingering respect for Britain as a fellow Germanic nation, that he genuinely hoped the British might accept a negotiated peace and saw the evacuation as a gesture of goodwill, a way of preserving their pride while still achieving his continental ambitions. Whether or not this is true, the practical effect was the same. 300,000 trained soldiers returned to Britain, reorganised, re-equipped, and eventually formed the core of the force that would land in Normandy 4 years later. The men who escaped at Dunkirk fought at El Alamein. They crossed into Italy. They waded ashore on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Hitler's moment of hesitation at Dunkirk, whether motivated by caution, ideology, or some twisted strategic calculation, cost him the war's most precious prize: the annihilation of the British Army and the removal of Britain as a combatant. It was the first great crack in the seemingly invincible facade of the Third Reich, and it would not be the last. With the British Army safely withdrawn to England, Hitler turned his attention to the question that would dominate the summer of 1940: how to finish the job. Britain, battered and exhausted, with France already collapsing and its last European allies suing for peace, was in a desperately vulnerable position. Churchill refused all peace overtures, but the rational military calculation, according to Germany's own naval planners, was that an invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, required first achieving air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. That task fell to the Luftwaffe and its commander, the vain, bombastic, and fundamentally unreliable Hermann Göring. The Battle of Britain, which began in earnest in July 1940 and reached its decisive phase in August and September, offers one of the clearest examples in military history of how a strategic blunder can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. By mid-August 1940, the Luftwaffe's strategy of attacking RAF Fighter Command's airfields, radar stations, and ground infrastructure was beginning to work. The strain on British pilots was becoming critical. Squadrons were flying 3 and 4 sorties a day. Pilots were sleeping in their cockpits between scrambles. The repair facilities at Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Manston, and other key airfields were being hit repeatedly, and the radar chain along the southern coast, the invisible shield that gave Fighter Command its crucial early warning, was under constant attack. Some stations had been forced temporarily off the air. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who commanded Fighter Command, was genuinely worried that he could not sustain the rate of attrition much longer. The RAF was, by some calculations, within 2 or 3 weeks of operational collapse, and then Hitler intervened. On August 25th, a formation of German bombers, almost certainly navigating by error, dropped bombs on London, the first such attack since the First World War. Churchill immediately ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The material damage was modest, but the psychological and political impact on Hitler was enormous. Furious at the humiliation of his capital being bombed, he stood before a cheering crowd in the Berlin Sports Palace on September 4th and thundered his promise of revenge. If the British attacked German cities by night, he would repay the British cities 100-fold. On September 7th, 1940, the ESR Luftwaffe shifted its strategic focus from attacking RAF Fighter Command's infrastructure to conducting massed bombing raids on London. The Blitz had begun. From a German strategic standpoint, this was a devastating mistake. By abandoning the attacks on the airfields and radar chain, just as they were achieving their objective, Hitler allowed Fighter Command to recover. The airfields were repaired. The radar stations were restored to full operation. New pilots were trained and new aircraft were built, faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, partly because the Spitfire and Hurricane factories in the English Midlands and North West were beyond the range of effective fighter escort. The Luftwaffe continued to mount massive raids, culminating in the Great Daylight Battle of September 15, 1940, when German formations suffered such crippling losses that Göring and Hitler were finally forced to abandon the idea of achieving the air superiority needed to support an invasion. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely and soon afterward quietly abandoned. Britain, against all reasonable expectation, had survived. The damage done to Britain's cities was terrible and the suffering of civilians immense. But strategically, the Blitz accomplished almost nothing. British war production, largely dispersed away from London, continued to grow. Public morale, rather than collapsing as the German planners had hoped, stiffened into the defiant spirit that Churchill had summoned, and the images of bombed churches, burning docks, and resolute fire wardens played no small part in hardening American public opinion against Germany and in favour of the beleaguered British, a factor of enormous long-term consequence. Hitler had allowed his temper to redirect an air campaign that was on the verge of success into one that was militarily irrelevant. Britain would stay in the war, and every resource the Reich now had to devote to the West was a resource that couldn't be sent east. The second great crack in the Third Reich had appeared, and this time it was plastered over with the fury of bombing raids that changed nothing strategically, but ensured that Britain would remain a thorn in Germany's side for the duration of the conflict. While the Battle of Britain was reaching its climax, a strange and deeply revealing episode played out that exposed the peculiar dysfunction at the heart of the Nazi inner circle. On the evening of May 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's deputy Führer and one of the earliest and most fanatical members of the Nazi Party, climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 110 twin-engine fighter at Augsburg Airfield in Bavaria and set course for Scotland. He was flying alone at night on a mission he had planned in secret over the preceding months, a mission to negotiate a peace settlement with Britain on behalf of the German Reich. What followed was, in the words of Churchill, one of the most bizarre episodes of the entire war. Hess had known Hitler since the early 1920s when, as a young volunteer in the SA, he had guarded the future Führer during the failed Munich beer hall putsch of November 1923. He had shared Hitler's cell at Landsberg prison after the putsch, transcribing large portions of Mein Kampf under Hitler's dictation. He had been Hitler's private secretary, his devoted follower, the man who introduced him to the concept of Lebensraum through the geopolitical ideas of Karl Haushofer. By 1941, however, Hess had been increasingly marginalized within the Nazi hierarchy. Martin Bormann, the scheming administrative chief who managed Hitler's personal affairs, had systematically cut Hess off from the Führer's access, routing documents through his own office and slowly reducing the deputy Führer to a ceremonial irrelevance. Hess, sensitive, earnest, and apparently genuinely convinced that the war with Britain was a terrible mistake that would destroy both nations, conceived his private peace mission as a way of restoring his standing with Hitler by achieving something spectacular. He parachuted onto a Scottish farm near Eaglesham in Renfrewshire in the early hours of May 11, 1941, and announced himself to the startled farmer who found him as Hauptmann Alfred Horn, requesting to be taken to the Duke of Hamilton, with whom he had had a fleeting social acquaintance at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. His stated aim was to propose a negotiated peace in which Britain would allow Germany a free hand in continental Europe in exchange for a guarantee of the British Empire's integrity. When the British government realised who they actually had in custody, the consternation was total. Churchill typically chose to treat the whole affair as a joke, reportedly asking whether Hess had been invited to Britain for the weekend when told of the incident. Stalin, when informed, initially suspected it was a British trick, perhaps a cover story for a secret Anglo-German deal aimed at turning Germany against the Soviet Union. The immediate effect on Hitler was volcanic. He was initially incredulous, then furious, then desperate to control the narrative. He had Hess publicly declared insane and issued a communiqué describing him as suffering from hallucinations. In reality, there was nothing hallucinated about Hess's motives. They were misguided and politically naive, but entirely coherent. The damage to Germany's prestige was significant. To the world, it appeared that one of Hitler's closest associates had deserted his post, panicked, or gone mad. The British milked the propaganda value of the episode for all it was worth, suggesting that the cracks in the Nazi leadership were wider than anyone had suspected. More concretely, the episode demonstrated the extraordinary degree to which personal ambition, delusion, and the poisonous court politics of the Nazi inner circle could produce outcomes that nobody had planned for and nobody could fully control. Hess spent the rest of the war in British captivity. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy, and sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau prison, where he remained until his death by suicide on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93. His son, Wolf Hess, who dedicated much of his life to campaigning for his father's release, never accepted the official account of Hess's mission, maintaining to the end that his father had acted as a man of peace. The world and history judged rather differently. If Dunkirk was the first crack and the Battle of Britain the second, then the third and most consequential of all Hitler's blunders was the decision to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, was the largest military operation in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 1,900 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They were supported by 3,300 tanks, nearly 2,800 aircraft, and 7,000 pieces of artillery. The Red Army, despite Stalin's increasingly desperate warnings from his own intelligence services that an invasion was imminent, was caught catastrophically off balance. Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would attack, convinced, in a catastrophic failure of judgment that mirrored Hitler's own, that his Nazi-Soviet pact partner would honour the agreement at least until the war with Britain was resolved. The opening weeks of Barbarossa were a stunning German triumph. Army Group North drove through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center smashed through Byelorussia toward Moscow, completing encirclements at Bialystok and Minsk that netted hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners. Army Group South swept through Ukraine toward Kiev and the Dnieper River. By the end of July 1941, Germany had inflicted losses on the Soviet Union that would have destroyed any other army in the world. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the first 6 weeks alone, a figure that staggers the imagination. Soviet air power had been virtually annihilated in the opening hours of the campaign, many aircraft destroyed on the ground before their pilots could scramble. To German officers who had studied the lessons of France and Poland, it seemed as though the Soviet Union would indeed crumble, as Hitler had predicted, like a rotten building that collapses when you kick in the front door, but it did not crumble. The Soviet Union was not France, and Stalin was not Gamelin. The country's geographic depth was enormous, and as German forces advanced deeper into the interior, the supply lines stretched dangerously thin. The roads, such as they were, had been designed for horse carts, not mechanized armies. The rail gauges were different from those in Western Europe, requiring time-consuming track conversions, before German trains could run into occupied territory. The summer heat turned the unpaved roads first to dust that choked engines and men alike, and then, with the autumn rains, into an impenetrable mud that the Germans called the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, which brought mobile operations to a near standstill. And all the while, new Soviet divisions were appearing from Siberia, from the Urals, from Kazakhstan, from a reserve pool that German planners had badly underestimated. The critical question that emerged in August 1941, as the initial momentum of Barbarossa began to slow, was one of strategic priority. Hitler's generals, led by Brauchitsch and Chief of Staff Franz Halder, believed the primary objective should be Moscow. Moscow was not simply the Soviet capital, it was the hub of the Soviet rail network, the center of Soviet industrial production, and the psychological heart of the Soviet state. Capturing it, they argued, would force a decisive battle that the Red Army could not refuse and could not survive. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was poised to drive straight for the Russian capital, and momentum was everything in armoured warfare. But Hitler disagreed. He had convinced himself that the economic objectives of the campaign, the capture of the Ukrainian breadbasket, the Donbas industrial region, and the oil fields of the Caucasus, were more important than capturing any single city. On August 21, 1941, over the furious protests of virtually every senior commander in the German army, Hitler issued Directive No. 34, redirecting Guderian's panzers south toward Kiev rather than east toward Moscow. The result was the Battle of Kiev, in which German forces encircled and destroyed an astonishing 665,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest encirclement in military history. By any conventional measure, it was a colossal tactical success. But the price was devastating. The diversion to Kiev consumed 6 critical weeks of the campaigning season, and when Hitler finally relented and authorized Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, in late September 1941, the autumn mud was already turning the roads into rivers of brown liquid, and the Russian winter was only weeks away. General Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army, watched the situation with mounting dread. He had been overruled at every turn, and his health was deteriorating under the strain of constant conflict with Hitler over strategic priorities. He suffered a heart attack in November 1941, at precisely the moment when German forces were within 15 miles of Moscow, close enough on a clear day that their spearheads claimed they could see the glint of sunlight on the gilded spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. The German soldiers who reached those furthest points had been marching and fighting since June. They were exhausted, poorly equipped for the conditions, and fighting in temperatures that would plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius. They had no winter clothing. Hitler had forbidden his logisticians to stockpile winter gear on the grounds that the war would be over before winter came. It was not over. The troops wrapped themselves in captured Soviet clothing and newspapers and froze. When a fresh Soviet counteroffensive under General Georgy Zhukov struck the overextended, exhausted German front on December 5, 1941, it shattered the illusion of inevitable German victory forever. Operation Typhoon failed. Moscow did not fall. Hitler's response to the crisis was to dismiss Brauchitsch on December 19, 1941, and assume personal command of the German army himself. He also relieved dozens of other senior commanders who he blamed for the winter crisis, including Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. His order that the front must hold, that there would be no retreats, no flexible withdrawal to shorter defensive lines, had a mixed effect. In some sectors, it may well have prevented a complete collapse of the kind that had destroyed Napoleon's Grande Armée. But it also trapped German forces in untenable positions, cut off from proper supply, and condemned thousands of men to unnecessary deaths. More fundamentally, Hitler's decision to take personal command of the army marked the beginning of the end of rational German military decision-making. From this point on, the Wehrmacht's operational planning would be dominated not by military professionals who understood logistics and the limits of the possible, but by a self-taught amateur who believed that will and determination could substitute for supplies, manpower, and strategic coherence. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, whose memoirs remain one of the most penetrating accounts of the war, described Hitler's military leadership with careful but devastating precision. He noted that Hitler possessed a genuine tactical intelligence, a remarkable memory for technical specifications and raw production numbers, and an almost instinctive grasp of certain aspects of modern warfare, particularly the value of surprise and the psychological dimension of combat. But he lacked the professional military education that teaches commanders to understand the relationship between ends, ways, and means, to ensure that the objectives they set are actually achievable with the forces and supplies available. Time and again, Hitler would order his army to hold this city, to capture that oil field, to advance to this line without making any provision for how these things were to be accomplished, with exhausted, understrength forces operating on supply lines stretched to breaking point. And when the inevitable failures came, he blamed his generals. He fired them, humiliated them, and in some cases, as we shall see, he destroyed them. The pattern of dismissals that began in the winter crisis of 1941 to 1942 was to have profound consequences for German military effectiveness throughout the rest of the war. Brauchitsch, as we have noted, was dismissed and spent the rest of the war in enforced retirement, dying before he could be tried for war crimes in October 1948. Rundstedt was dismissed and then recalled in 1942, only to be dismissed again after the Normandy landings, famously retorting to Field Marshal Keitel's demand for solutions, "Make peace, you fools! What else can you do?" Leeb was allowed to resign in January 1942 and never given another command, living out the remainder of his years on his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, after a surprisingly lenient sentence at the High Command trial that gave him effectively time served. Georg von Küchler, who had replaced Leeb at Army Group North, received a 20-year sentence at the same trial, later reduced to 12 years, before being released in February 1953. Poor Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, whose First Panzer Army had led some of the most dramatic armoured thrusts of the entire war, was dismissed by Hitler in March 1944 and subsequently captured by the Allies, extradited to Yugoslavia, tried for war crimes and eventually handed over to the Soviet Union, where he died in Vladimir Central Prison on November 13, 1954, making him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet captivity. Each dismissal removed from the German order of battle a general of proven operational ability and replaced him, in effect, with Hitler's own increasingly erratic judgment. The decision that many historians consider Hitler's single greatest strategic blunder came on December 11, 1941, just 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had brought the United States into the Pacific War. On that date, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States of America. It is difficult even now to fully comprehend the strategic logic, or rather the complete absence of strategic logic, that drove this decision. The United States had just been attacked by Japan, Germany's nominal ally in the Tripartite Pact, but was under no obligation whatsoever to declare war on Germany. President Franklin Roosevelt was, of course, deeply sympathetic to Britain and had been providing enormous material support through programs like Lend-Lease, but American public opinion, shaped by memories of the First World War and powerful isolationist currents, was strongly opposed to direct involvement in the European conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor had united the American public behind the war in the Pacific, but without a German declaration of war, Roosevelt would have faced enormous political difficulty in turning the country's attention and resources toward Europe. Hitler solved that problem for him with a single speech. Why did Hitler do it? The reasons he gave were a mixture of the ideological and the cynical. He claimed falsely that the United States had already been engaged in acts of war against Germany through its naval escorts of British convoys in the Atlantic. He convinced himself, based on deeply flawed racial theories, that the United States was a fundamentally weak nation, a racial hodgepodge incapable of sustained military effort, whose industrial output was exaggerated by Jewish-controlled media. He also hoped that by declaring war on America alongside Japan, he could persuade the Japanese to reciprocate by declaring war on the Soviet Union in the East, creating a two-front nightmare for Stalin. The Japanese shrewdly declined to do so. They had their hands full in the Pacific and had no desire to take on the Soviet Far Eastern Army, which Zhukov had already demonstrated at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939 was perfectly capable of destroying Japanese forces in open battle. The consequences of Hitler's American declaration were catastrophic and irreversible. The United States brought to the Allied cause an industrial capacity that simply dwarfed anything Germany could produce, even with the resources of occupied Europe behind it. American factories produced 47,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, a number that surpassed the entire German production of aircraft for the year by a factor of more than 3. American shipyards launched new Liberty ships faster than the German U-boats could sink them. American ordnance factories poured out artillery shells, tank rounds, rifles, and ammunition in volumes that made any German calculation of strategic balance laughably inadequate. The influx of American forces into Britain in 1942 and 1943 gave the Allies the manpower and the logistical muscle to contemplate operations that would have been impossible otherwise, including the landings in North Africa in November 1942, the assault on Sicily and then mainland Italy in 1943, and ultimately the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944. Every one of those operations was possible only because the United States was in the war. And the United States was in the war as a European belligerent because Adolf Hitler declared war on it. It was by any measure one of the most inexplicable and self-destructive decisions in military history. There is a footnote to this episode that reveals much about the atmosphere in Hitler's headquarters during this period. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the Wehrmacht's operational staff who served at Hitler's side throughout the war and was ultimately hanged at Nuremberg for war crimes in October 1946, had expressed doubts about the wisdom of declaring war on America, though he was careful never to do so in Hitler's presence. Jodl was a man of considerable military intelligence, and he was not alone among Hitler's inner circle in recognizing the catastrophic implications of adding the American Colossus to Germany's list of enemies. But by December, 1941. The culture of Hitler's headquarters had become one in which dissent was dangerous and agreement was rewarded. The generals who spoke their minds found themselves dismissed, humiliated, or, worse, those who told Hitler what he wanted to hear survived. This toxic dynamic, which had been building since Hitler first began to override his professional military staff in the late 1930s, had by the end of 1941 transformed the German high command from a body capable of genuine strategic deliberation into a collection of yes-men and survivors, still enormously capable in tactical and operational terms, but increasingly unable to shape the grand strategic decisions that would determine the war's outcome. The year 1942 began with Germany still in a position of enormous strength. Despite the failure at Moscow and the shock of the Soviet winter counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht had stabilized the Eastern Front by the spring. German forces remained deep inside Soviet territory, controlling vast areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The industrial and agricultural regions that Hitler had coveted were still largely under German occupation. And in the spring and summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, a massive offensive in southern Russia aimed at seizing the Caucasus oil fields and cutting the Volga River, the great artery along which Soviet supplies flowed north from the Caspian Basin. The offensive, at its outset, achieved spectacular success. Army Group South smashed through Soviet defenses, advanced deep into the Donbass, and drove toward both Stalingrad on the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus simultaneously. Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist's Army Group A plunged into the Caucasus, briefly planting a German battle flag atop Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe, on August 21, 1942, though this was more a propaganda stunt than a military achievement. By late August, German forces had reached the northern suburbs of Stalingrad and were engaged in brutal urban fighting for the city. Stalingrad. The name has become synonymous with catastrophe, with the limits of human endurance, with the turning of a tide. But it is worth asking, how did Germany come to fight for this particular city with such total commitment that the fate of an entire army was staked on its capture? The answer lies in a series of decisions that demonstrate with horrible clarity how Hitler's personal obsessions and his unwillingness to accept military reality could transform what began as a strategic objective into a catastrophic end in itself. The original purpose of the advance towards Stalingrad was not to capture the city as such, but to secure the German flank along the Volga, while Army Group A captured the Caucasus oil fields. The city bore Stalin's name, and that made it psychologically significant to Hitler in a way that far exceeded its purely military value. As German forces became drawn into a savage battle for the city's factory districts and apartment blocks through August and September 1942, Hitler became increasingly fixated on taking it completely. He transferred forces from Army Group A in the Caucasus to reinforce the Stalingrad fighting, fatally weakening the drive toward the oil fields that were supposed to be the campaign's primary strategic objective. The result was that Germany achieved neither objective fully. It failed to take the oil fields in the Caucasus, and it paid an enormous price for the city on the Volga. The man responsible for the fighting at Stalingrad was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who commanded the German Sixth Army, the largest single army Germany had ever put in the field. Paulus was a meticulous staff officer, brilliant in planning and organization, but lacking the aggressive independence of judgment that the situation in Stalingrad ultimately demanded. By November 1942, the Sixth Army had fought its way into the center of the city, but had suffered devastating losses in the brutal close-quarters combat of the ruins. The Soviet defenders, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, had developed innovative tactics for urban warfare that neutralized much of the Germans' advantages in combined arms operations, keeping fighting at close quarters to minimize the effect of German artillery and air support. Both sides fought for individual buildings, factory floors and staircases in battles of extraordinary ferocity. Then, on November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment aimed not at the German forces in Stalingrad itself, but at the vulnerable flanks held by Romanian and Italian armies north and south of the city. Soviet armoured columns smashed through the inadequately equipped flank forces with brutal efficiency and closed the encirclement on November 23rd, trapping Paulus and the entire Sixth Army, approximately 300,000 men, in a pocket around Stalingrad. The trap had been sprung. What happened next illustrates the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's refusal to accept military reality. Paulus requested permission to break out to the west while his forces still had the fuel and ammunition to do so, a breakout that most senior officers believed had a reasonable chance of success. Hitler refused absolutely. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position, declared Stalingrad a fortress, and promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the encircled army by air and that a relief force would break through to its position. Both promises were hollow. The Luftwaffe could never supply more than a fraction of the daily requirements of 300,000 men. The relief force, spearheaded by Manstein's army group Don, came within 50 kilometers of the pocket in mid-December, but could advance no further against fierce Soviet resistance. Hitler forbade Paulus from breaking out toward the relief force even when it was close enough that a determined attack might have linked up with it, because any breakout would require abandoning Stalingrad. And abandoning Stalingrad was something Hitler could not conceive of. Through December, January, and into February, the 6th, army died by degrees. Starvation, frostbite, disease, and relentless Soviet attacks ground down the trapped soldiers. By January, the daily ration had been reduced to less than 200 calories per man. Soldiers ate their horses, their leather belts, and each other's shoe leather. On February 1st, 1943, having been promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in what amounted to an invitation to die rather than surrender, as no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in the field, Friedrich Paulus walked out of the ruins of the Univermag department store basement and surrendered to Soviet forces. The next day, the last German resistance in Stalingrad was extinguished. Approximately 91,000 German soldiers survived to become Soviet prisoners, including 24 generals. Of those 91,000, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany, most dying in Soviet captivity from disease, exhaustion, and the conditions in Soviet prison camps. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers had died in the Stalingrad pocket. The defeat was total, devastating, and irreversible. The strategic consequences of Stalingrad extended far beyond the loss of the Sixth Army. It destroyed the myth of German invincibility that had been the foundation of Hitler's political authority and the bedrock of his military alliances. It shattered the morale of Germany's allies, Italy, Romania, and Hungary, whose forces had been destroyed on the flanks of the Stalingrad pocket. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning, a spectacle of controlled grief that could not conceal the reality that Germany had suffered a defeat from which its Eastern strategy would never recover. More practically, Stalingrad consumed irreplaceable German manpower and equipment at precisely the moment when Germany's strategic reserves were being exhausted. The Wehrmacht that emerged from the 1942 to 1943 winter was a diminished force, qualitatively still formidable but quantitatively incapable of the kind of offensive operations that had characterized 1941 and 1942. After Stalingrad, German strategy on the Eastern Front increasingly became reactive, responding to Soviet offensives rather than dictating the pace of operations through their own. There was one significant exception: Operation Citadel, launched in July 1943, which attempted to eliminate the Kursk salient, a large bulge in the front line west of Kursk, by attacking its flanks simultaneously from north and south. The theory was sound enough. The elimination of the salient would shorten the German front by hundreds of kilometers and destroy the Soviet forces within it. But the execution became a masterclass in how to waste military opportunity through hesitation and poor timing. The plan had been ready since April 1943, and several senior commanders, including Manstein, argued strongly for attacking immediately before the Soviets had time to construct defensive works. Hitler repeatedly postponed the attack, partly to wait for deliveries of new Tiger and Panther tanks that he believed would give German forces a decisive armoured superiority. The delays proved fatal. By the time Operation Citadel finally began on July 5, 1943, Soviet intelligence had provided Marshal Zhukov with a comprehensive picture of the German plan, and the Red Army had spent months constructing the deepest and most elaborate defensive system seen in the entire war: a belt of minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions, and dug-in tank formations that extended for over 50 kilometers in depth. The Germans attacked directly into the teeth of this prepared defense and bled themselves white. Within 9 days, after the largest tank battle in history at Prokhorovka on July 12th, Hitler called off the offensive and the initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Germany never mounted another major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk marked the definitive turning point on the Eastern Front, but the blame for the defeat lay not primarily in the tactical handling of the battle, in which German forces actually performed with great skill against overwhelming odds, but in the fundamental strategic mistake of attacking at all in a defensive situation, at a time and place of the enemy's choosing, after delaying long enough to allow him to prepare his defences comprehensively. Hitler had wasted the assets he needed, depleted Germany's armoured reserves at a moment when he could least afford to do so, and handed the strategic initiative to the Soviets permanently. General Heinz Guderian, who had been recalled from disgrace to serve as Inspector General of the Panzer Forces and who had argued passionately against Operation Citadel on exactly these grounds, watched the debacle with a mixture of grief and fury. "I had sought," he later wrote, "to make it plain that our attack would certainly not bring about a decisive improvement in our overall situation. Hitler had not listened." The pattern of dismissals and marginalizations that had begun in 1941 continued through 1942 and 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox who had conducted the North Africa campaign with brilliance and audacity, was increasingly undermined by Hitler's refusal to provide adequate supplies and by the interference of Italian command structures that complicated his operations. The fall of Tunis in May 1943 and the loss of the last German forces in Africa, 250,000 men who surrendered to the Allies, was the product of strategic overextension and mismanagement of resources that Hitler himself had authorized. Hitler had refused to permit an orderly evacuation of the Afrika Korps, even when it became clear that the position was untenable, squandering troops he could not replace on a theatre of operations that was peripheral to the main German strategic interests. The loss of North Africa opened the Mediterranean to Allied operations and led directly to the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the Italian mainland in September, forcing Germany to divert forces to a new front. At the same time, it was trying to stabilize the situation in Russia after Stalingrad and Kursk. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, Germany's U-boat campaign, which had come tantalizingly close to strangling Britain's supply lines in 1942, was being decisively defeated. Admiral Karl Dönitz had built his career on the premise that a large fleet of submarines operating in coordinated wolfpack attacks could sever Britain's maritime supply lines and bring the island nation to its knees before American intervention could tip the balance. And in the first years of the war, his U-boats had achieved extraordinary results. From 1939 to 1943, his submarines sank over 3,000 Allied ships, totaling some 14 million tons of shipping, an effort that at its peak in November 1942 seemed to be outpacing Allied ability to replace the losses. The U-boats hunted in packs across the North Atlantic, coordinated by radio from Dönitz's headquarters, attacking convoys and individual merchantmen in night surface attacks that exploited the limitations of early Allied radar and sonar technology. They became the weapon that most directly threatened Britain's ability to continue the war, more so than any German army or air force operation. But by May 1943, the tide had turned catastrophically. Allied advances in anti-submarine warfare, including improved radar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers that could cover the mid-Atlantic gap that had previously been beyond land-based air cover, code breaking through the Enigma decryption program at Bletchley Park, high-frequency direction finding that could locate submarines by their radio transmissions, and improved depth charges and hedgehog weapons, combined to make the Atlantic increasingly lethal for German U-boats. In May 1943 alone, the Germans lost 43 submarines, nearly as many as they had lost in all of 1942. Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely, a decision he described in his war diary as a temporary withdrawal. In fact, it was a decisive defeat from which the U-boat campaign never fully recovered. The Germans continued to build and operate submarines to the end of the war, and individual boats continued to achieve successes, but never again did the Wolfpack strategy come close to achieving its strategic objective. The battle that might have won Germany the war in the West had been lost. Dönitz was a formidable naval commander, and the defeat of the U-boat campaign was not primarily his fault. The fundamental problem was a mismatch between strategic ambition and industrial capacity. Germany had begun the war with only 57 operational U-boats, far fewer than the 300 that Dönitz had estimated the minimum necessary to deliver a decisive blow against British shipping. Hitler had prioritised surface ships and other weaponry during the pre-war naval build-up, and by the time the U-boat construction program was accelerated, Allied countermeasures were advancing faster than German submarine technology could adapt. The introduction of the revolutionary Type 21 submarine, with its greatly improved underwater speed and endurance that made it a genuinely formidable weapon against the new Allied anti-submarine defences, came too late to affect the war's outcome. Only 2 Type 21 boats were declared fully operational before the German surrender in May 1945, and neither conducted a full operational patrol. Had Germany launched a crash program to build Type 21 submarines in 1942 rather than 1943, the story of the Atlantic might have been different. Instead, Hitler's strategic priorities had allocated resources to the army and to Albert Speer's armaments production for the Eastern Front, leaving the naval program chronically underfunded until it was too late to matter. Thus, failure to properly support the U-boat campaign was symptomatic of a broader strategic incoherence that characterized German war planning from 1941 onward. Germany was, at its core, a continental land power, fighting a war that increasingly required it to project force across oceans and to contest global sea lanes. Its enemies included the world's greatest maritime power, Britain, and the world's greatest industrial power, the United States, whose production alone could outpace German output in virtually every category of military equipment. Against this combination, Germany's only rational strategy was one that could achieve a decisive result before Allied material superiority became overwhelming, and specifically one that avoided the nightmare of a two-front war that had destroyed the Second Reich in the First World War. Hitler had been aware of this danger since he wrote Mein Kampf in the 1920s, and yet he proceeded step by step to create precisely that scenario. A war against Britain in the West and the Soviet Union in the East, with the United States added to the coalition in December 1941. He had created the very strategic situation that he had warned, in his own writings, would be fatal to Germany. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, reflecting on the strategic situation after the war, put it with characteristic precision. He noted that Germany's only chance of winning the war after 1941 lay in achieving a decisive military result in the East before American power could make itself fully felt, and that this required a fundamentally different approach to the Eastern campaign than Hitler had pursued, one that relied on mobile, operationally flexible defense and targeted offensive strokes, rather than the rigid holding of every inch of ground that Hitler's instinct demanded. Hitler, Manstein wrote, believed that the outcome of wars was decided by an act of will. His insistence on holding fast at any price was his way of imposing his will on events. But will, as Germany's shattered armies were discovering, was not a substitute for supplies, manpower, and strategic coherence. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as a key operational planner throughout the war, offered a damning assessment of Hitler's strategic thinking in the post-war years, noting that Hitler lacked the professional military education that would have taught him to distinguish between what he wanted to achieve and what he could realistically achieve with the forces available. This gap between ambition and capacity grew wider with every passing year of the war, as the Wehrmacht's losses in the East accumulated, as the Allied bombing campaign began to eat into German industrial production, and as the ring of steel slowly tightened around Fortress Europe. Yet Hitler continued, to the very end, to issue orders and plan operations as though Germany's military position remained what it had been in the summer of 1941. He clung to the belief that some combination of new weapons technology, unexpected Allied setbacks, and force of will could reverse the strategic tide, even as the evidence against this belief became overwhelming. One of the most revealing examples of this pattern came in late 1943 and early 1944, as the Allies prepared their great invasion of northwestern Europe. The German High Command knew an invasion was coming. The question was where and when. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been tasked by Hitler to inspect and strengthen the coastal defences known as the Atlantic Wall, believed the invasion must be defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours before Allied forces could consolidate a beachhead. He wanted to place the armoured reserves close to the coast, ready to counterattack immediately. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, took the opposite view. He believed the Allies could not be stopped on the beaches and should be allowed to come ashore, whereupon a massive armoured counterattack from the interior would cut off and destroy the beachhead. It was a genuine and serious strategic disagreement between two of Germany's most experienced commanders. Hitler resolved it in the worst possible way, by splitting the armoured reserves between the two viewpoints, giving neither commander enough tanks to execute his preferred strategy, and by insisting that the largest armoured reserve remain under his personal control, so that neither Rommel nor Rundstedt could commit it without his specific authorization. When the Allied landings came on June 6, 1944, the consequences of Hitler's divided command were immediately apparent. The great armoured reserve, the panzer divisions that Rommel desperately needed to launch an immediate counterattack, could not be committed without Hitler's personal order. Hitler, convinced that Normandy was a feint and that the main Allied landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, where Patton's fictitious army group was supposedly poised to strike, refused to release the armoured reserve for the entire critical first day. By the time German armour began to move toward the beachhead, the window for defeating the invasion on the beaches had closed. The Allies had established their beachhead, and the question had shifted from whether to destroy it to whether it could be contained. The answer, as subsequent weeks would show, was no. By late July 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy began in earnest, and within weeks American and British forces were sweeping across France with a speed and momentum that reminded German veterans of their own blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940. France was liberated. Germany's last western buffer zone was stripped away. General Heinz Guderian, who had been recalled to serve as chief of the General Staff in the aftermath of the July 20th bomb plot, put the blame for the Normandy disaster squarely on Hitler's insistence on controlling the armoured reserve himself. The battle, Guderian wrote, was lost before it began because the means of defeating the invasion at its most vulnerable moment were withheld from the commanders who needed them. This was characteristic Hitler. The belief that by retaining personal control he was exercising superior judgment, when in reality he was simply introducing fatal delays and denying operational flexibility to the professionals best placed to use it. The question of the July 20th, 1944 bomb plot deserves extended attention because it represents both a symptom and a cause of the Wehrmacht's unravelling. By the summer of 1944, a significant group within the German officer corps had concluded that Hitler was not merely an incompetent supreme commander, but a direct threat to Germany's survival, and that his removal by any means necessary was the only way to save what remained of the country. The conspiracy that crystallized around Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had lost an eye, a hand and 2 fingers in North Africa, drew together a remarkable coalition of generals, staff officers, diplomats and civilians who shared the conviction that Germany must make peace before total destruction fell upon it. The plan was to kill Hitler with a bomb placed in his conference room at his East Prussian headquarters, the Wolfschanze or Wolf's Lair, then use the Reserve Army's home forces to seize control of Berlin and the major government ministries under the codename Operation Valkyrie, after which a new government would seek an armistice with the Western Allies. The bomb went off on July 20th, 1944. It failed to kill Hitler. The circumstances of that failure have been analysed exhaustively by historians ever since. The briefcase containing the bomb had been moved slightly under the conference table. A heavy table leg deflected much of the blast. 4 officers were killed. Hitler emerged with ruptured eardrums, singed hair and minor burns, but essentially unharmed, an outcome he immediately interpreted as providential, as confirmation that fate had preserved him to lead Germany to ultimate victory. The physical survival of Hitler mattered immensely, because Operation Valkyrie depended entirely on news of his death to spark the military takeover. With Hitler demonstrably alive and broadcasting on German radio within hours, the conspiracy collapsed. Its key participants were arrested, tortured and executed, often in the brutal slow strangulation method that Hitler personally ordered, and that was filmed for his viewing pleasure. The subsequent investigation, conducted by the Gestapo with characteristic thoroughness, spread like a poison through the German officer corps, reaching anyone who had had any contact with the conspirators. General Gunther Blumentritt later estimated that the plot and its aftermath destroyed or marginalized hundreds of the best remaining officers in the Wehrmacht. Among those caught in the net was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the most famous German soldier of the war. Rommel had not been part of the assassination plot itself, but he had been approached by conspirators and had privately expressed the view that the war was lost and Hitler should be approached to seek a negotiated peace, a position that was treasonous enough in the atmosphere of July 1944. When the Gestapo investigation implicated him, Hitler was presented with a choice: a public trial that would destroy the legend of the Desert Fox and damage German morale, or a private offer of suicide in exchange for a hero's funeral and protection for his family. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took the pill. He was given a state funeral. His death was publicly attributed to wounds suffered in an Allied air attack on his staff car in July. The truth only emerged after the war. The man who had been Hitler's most celebrated commander, the general whose victories in North Africa had made him a household name across the world, had been murdered by the regime he had served. It was a fitting emblem of what the Third Reich had become, a system that consumed and destroyed even those who served it most brilliantly. The conspiracy and its suppression had a further devastating effect on German military effectiveness. It accelerated Hitler's already deeply pathological distrust of his professional officers to the point where rational military advice became virtually impossible to deliver. After July 20th, Hitler surrounded himself with ever more stringent security measures and restricted his contacts with the military to a smaller and smaller circle of men who he believed were personally loyal. Senior officers were required to swear personal loyalty oaths, not just to Germany, but specifically to Hitler himself. Orders were issued directly to unit commanders, bypassing the normal chain of command, in an attempt to prevent any organized military response to another coup attempt. The result was a command structure of Byzantine complexity and chronic inefficiency, in which competing authorities issued conflicting orders, essential supplies were misrouted, and the flexibility that had been the hallmark of German military operations in the early war years was replaced by a rigid top-down system that made rapid response to battlefield developments almost impossible. The situation was made worse by the rise of men like Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann within the power structure. Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, who commanded the vast SS apparatus, including the Waffen-SS, the concentration camp network, and the SD intelligence service, had been given command of the Army Group Vistula in January 1945, a catastrophic appointment that placed one of the most powerful men in the regime and one of the most dedicated adherents of Nazi ideology in charge of military forces defending the approaches to Berlin. Himmler had no military training and no operational experience, and the results were predictable. The men who actually wore the black uniform of the Waffen-SS and had fought on every front from the Arctic to North Africa were, in many cases, formidable soldiers. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Das Reich Division, and other elite Waffen-SS formations had demonstrated operational brilliance in countless engagements. But placing Himmler himself in operational command of an army group was a decision so divorced from military logic that even many SS officers found it difficult to comprehend. At the Nuremberg trials, held from November 1945 to October 1946, the International Military Tribunal formally declared the entire SS a criminal organization, and the question of how to distinguish between the SS as an instrument of terror and genocide and the Waffen-SS as a fighting force would occupy German courts and politics for decades afterward. Martin Bormann, who had gradually made himself indispensable as Hitler's personal secretary and administrative manager, presented a different but equally damaging problem. His control over access to Hitler meant that by 1944 and 1945, virtually all information reaching Hitler had passed through Bormann's hands, and Bormann had every incentive to filter that information in ways that served his own power. Commanders who needed quick decisions from Hitler found their reports delayed, modified, or simply never delivered. Those who managed to reach Hitler directly often found that Bormann had already shaped his expectations in ways that made the delivery of bad news, let alone contrary advice, extraordinarily difficult. The children of these men, including Martin Bormann Jr., who converted to Catholicism after the war and devoted his life to atonement for his father's crimes, and Gudrun Himmler, who remained a devoted supporter of her father's memory until her death in 2018, would carry the weight of this inheritance for the rest of their lives. The wider question of how Nazi leaders' families processed the legacy of the Third Reich would produce some of the most complex and revealing human stories of the entire post-war period. It is worth examining at this point what Germany's best military commanders actually thought of the strategic situation. as it developed through 1943 and 1944. The opinions of the German generals about Allied commanders are particularly revealing because they demonstrate both the professionalism and the perceptiveness of officers who, despite serving a criminal regime, brought genuine expertise and clear analytical minds to their assessment of the military balance. General Alfred Jodl, who signed the German surrender in Reims on May 7, 1945, and was subsequently hanged at Nuremberg in October 1946, was not a man given to admiring his enemies, but even he had said of George Patton that he was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. This assessment reflected a deep understanding of what made American generalship effective. The combination of industrial-scale logistics with a willingness to take operational risks and exploit momentum that the Germans recognized as essentially similar to their own blitzkrieg approach. Heinz Guderian himself, the pioneer of German armoured warfare, expressed genuine respect for Patton's operational methods, noting that his victories were achieved through exactly the kind of aggressive, momentum-driven armoured tactics that Guderian had developed and championed in the German army. "I hear much about General Patton," Guderian acknowledged, "and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." The bitterest irony of this assessment is that Guderian, the man whose genius had made blitzkrieg possible and whose armoured thrusts had been among the most brilliant military operations of the entire war, had been dismissed by Hitler in December 1941 for, among other things, ordering a limited tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions during the Moscow crisis without waiting for explicit permission, a decision that saved thousands of lives but violated Hitler's standing orders against retreat. Guderian was only recalled in February 1943 as Inspector of Armoured Troops after the Stalingrad catastrophe made it clear that Germany desperately needed his expertise. Even then, his relationship with Hitler was perpetually strained, and he was finally sacked again in March 1945 after one argument too many. The pattern was depressingly familiar, Hitler dismissing the most capable officers, and then, when the consequences became undeniable, recalling them in desperation, only to dismiss them again when they said things he did not want to hear. The German view of British military leadership was more ambivalent. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as Chief of Staff under both Rommel and Kesselring, acknowledged the formidable qualities of British infantry and the remarkable professionalism of British formations, noting that the hardest, toughest in attack and most persistent in defence were the British divisions. Rommel himself, after the fall of Tobruk, had expressed frustration with what he saw as excessively cautious British leadership, famously telling captured British officers that they had fought like lions and been led by donkeys, a phrase that captured a perception shared by many German commanders, that British tactical executions sometimes lagged behind the genuine fighting quality of British troops. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, whose defence of Italy delayed the Allied advance for over a year, and who was tried and convicted of war crimes for ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Cave massacre of March 1944, subsequently commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment, and then released in 1952 on grounds of declining health, had a particular reason to respect British tenacity. It was British. And Commonwealth forces that had fought their way up the Italian peninsula against his defensive masterwork, the Gustav Line and the subsequent Gothic Line, in campaigns of extraordinary difficulty and commitment. The German assessment of Soviet military commanders underwent perhaps the most dramatic evolution of any Allied force. At the outset of Operation Barbarossa, the prevailing German view of Soviet military leadership ranged from contempt to dismissal. The purges of 1937 and 1938, in which Stalin had executed the vast majority of the Red Army's senior officers on largely fabricated charges of treason, had left the Soviet military without experienced leadership at the operational and strategic levels, and the dismal performance of the Red Army in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 1940, when enormous Soviet forces struggled for months to overcome tiny Finland, seemed to confirm the German assessment of Soviet military incompetence. Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, whose 1st Panzer Army had fought through the initial encirclements of Barbarossa and had captured more Soviet prisoners in single battles than most countries had soldiers in their entire armies, later reflected with remarkable honesty on how his assessment of the Soviets had evolved. From the very beginning, the Russians proved themselves first-class warriors. Our successes in the first months of the war can be explained by better training. Having gained combat experience, the Russians became first-class soldiers, and they fought with exceptional perseverance and had astounding endurance. This evolution in German military thinking about their Soviet opponents mirrors, in miniature, the broader evolution of the entire Eastern campaign. The confident expectation of swift victory giving way to grudging respect, then genuine concern, and finally, after Stalingrad and Kursk, something approaching fear. Franz Halder, chief of the Army High Command from 1938 to 1942, had written, in his diary as early as July 1941, barely 3 weeks into Barbarossa, that the extent of the country and the endlessness of the resistance will swallow up our forces. It was a prescient assessment that he conveyed to Hitler with no apparent effect. Hitler dismissed Halder in September 1942. Ostensibly because of disagreements over the handling of Case Blue, but in reality because Halder continued to provide accurate assessments of Soviet strength that Hitler found unacceptable. Halder's replacement, Kurt Zeitzler, was younger, more compliant, and less inclined to contradict the Führer. He was also considerably less able. The dismissal of Halder and the installation of yes-men in his place was entirely characteristic of Hitler's approach to military advice. He wanted information that confirmed his existing beliefs, not accurate intelligence that might require him to reconsider his plans. Autumn of 1944, Germany's military situation was desperate on every front simultaneously. In the east, Soviet forces had driven across Poland and were approaching the borders of Germany itself. In the west, after the liberation of France, Allied armies were advancing toward the Rhine. In Italy, German forces were retreating northward under pressure from Allied armies that had finally broken through the Gothic Line. The Reich's air defences were being systematically dismantled by the Allied strategic bombing campaign, which by this stage had grown into an operation of staggering scale. American B-17 and B-24 bombers from bases in England flew by day, while British Lancaster and Halifax bombers struck by night in a combined offensive that was reducing Germany's major industrial and transportation centres to rubble. The oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania, which had provided a significant portion of Germany's aviation fuel, had been so heavily damaged that Luftwaffe training programs were being curtailed due to fuel shortages. The transportation network that moved raw materials and finished weapons from factory to front was being systematically destroyed. Yet Hitler continued, in the autumn of 1944, to plan and authorize one more major offensive, the last great gamble of the Third Reich, an operation whose underlying concept reflected all the magical thinking and strategic unreality that had characterized his leadership from the beginning. Operation Autumn Mist, better known in the English-speaking world as the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16, 1944, was Hitler's attempt to recreate the triumph of 1940 by sending armoured columns through the Ardennes once more, this time to reach Antwerp and cut off the Allied forces north of the breakthrough, just as the earlier campaign had cut off and isolated the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. The plan had a certain audacious logic that captured something genuine about the strategic situation. The Allied forces were extended along a long front, their supply lines were strained, and a sufficiently bold stroke through the weakly held Ardennes sector might, under the right circumstances, create a crisis that would force the Western Allies to the negotiating table. Hitler convinced himself that a major setback would split the coalition between American and British interests, that Churchill and Roosevelt's alliance would fracture under the strain, and that Germany might then be able to make a separate peace with the West, freeing its forces to concentrate against the Soviet Union in the East. This analysis was, at every level, detached from reality. The Western Allied coalition was not, by December 1944, in any danger of fracturing. Churchill and Roosevelt were personally committed to the alliance and had made unconditional surrender the stated Allied war aim. More practically, the forces available to Germany for the Ardennes offensive were a pale shadow of the armoured might that had swept through France in 1940. The fuel reserves that had been assembled for the operation were inadequate, so inadequate that the plan actually depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps along the route of advance to keep the panzer columns moving, an extraordinarily fragile operational premise. The men who fought in the offensive were, in many cases, brave and determined, but they were fighting against a much better equipped and better supplied enemy that, after a temporary shock, responded with the kind of operational flexibility and material weight that Germany could no longer match. The initial German breakthrough achieved genuine surprise and pushed deep into the Allied lines, creating the bulge in the front that gave the battle its English name. For a few days, there was real concern in Allied headquarters. The fog and cloud that suppressed Allied air operations for the first week of the offensive was exactly the weather Germany needed to neutralize American and British air power, which had become the decisive edge in virtually every engagement since 1943. When the skies cleared, however, the story changed completely. Allied aircraft were everywhere. German columns were strafed and bombed on every road. The fuel that Germany needed to sustain the advance did not materialize because the Allied dumps had either been destroyed before capture or proved insufficient for the German requirements. By Christmas Day, with American forces under General George Patton, whom the Germans themselves admired as the most capable of the Allied commanders, having executed an extraordinary 90-degree turn and driven north to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne, the offensive was clearly stalling. By January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated and the Allied front was back to roughly where it had been before December 16th. Germany had spent the last of its strategic reserves, including hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of irreplaceable experienced soldiers, on an offensive that had achieved nothing of lasting strategic value. The decision to launch the Ardennes offensive was not, in itself, necessarily irrational if one accepts that Hitler's options were severely limited by late 1944, but the specific plan, with its unrealistic fuel assumptions, its dependence on capturing Allied supplies, and its grandiose strategic objectives, reflected the same pattern of wishful thinking that had characterized Hitler's military decision-making throughout the war. The generals who were asked to execute it, including Field Marshal Walter Model and Panzer General Hasso von Manteuffel, were realistic about what could actually be achieved and privately believed that even a successful offensive could not achieve Antwerp. They were overruled. Hitler's will had replaced strategic calculation, and the result was the final squandering of Germany's last offensive capability. Even as the Battle of the Bulge was playing out its doomed course, a parallel disaster was unfolding in the east. The Great Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on January 12, 1945, struck the already weakened German forces in Poland with overwhelming force. In less than 3 weeks, Soviet armies advanced 300 kilometers and captured Warsaw, Krakow and Łódź, reaching the Oder River by February 1945 and establishing bridgeheads on German soil. The speed and scale of the Soviet advance reflected everything that Germany had failed to accomplish in the West: a massive superiority of men and material, coordinated operations across multiple army groups, and a logistical system capable of sustaining rapid armoured exploitation over enormous distances. The Red Army of 1945 was a completely different force from the one that had been caught flat-footed in June 1941. It had learned at terrible cost every lesson that 4 years of warfare against the German Wehrmacht could teach, and it was now executing those lessons with a ruthless proficiency that overwhelmed German resistance. Hitler's response to the Vistula-Oder catastrophe was characteristically detached from reality. He refused to authorize meaningful withdrawals, insisted on holding cities declared fortresses that had been bypassed and surrounded by Soviet mobile forces, and continued to demand offensive counterattacks from forces that existed only on paper or that were too depleted and ill-supplied to mount anything more than local counterblows. He relieved commanders who argued for withdrawal, including General Joseph Harp and others, and replaced them with men willing to promise the impossible. He convinced himself, periodically and increasingly desperately, that secret weapons, new divisions being formed in the Reich's final industrial convulsions, or a split in the Allied coalition would reverse the situation. None of these hopes materialized. The secret weapons program, known by the shorthand designation Wunderwaffe or Wonder Weapons, represents one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire story of Germany's technological war. Germany possessed, in the early 1940s, the world's most advanced military technology research program. German scientists and engineers had developed the first operational jet aircraft, the Me-262, which flew significantly faster than any Allied piston-engined fighter and represented a potentially revolutionary leap in aerial warfare. They had developed the V-1 flying bomb, the world's first cruise missile, and the V-2 ballistic rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, and the precursor to both the American and Soviet space programs and the intercontinental ballistic missiles of the Cold War. They had developed advanced acoustic torpedoes, radar-absorbing materials, and the revolutionary Type 21 submarine, whose underwater performance would define submarine design for the next decade. They had made significant advances in proximity fuses, synthetic fuels, and infrared night vision. Any one of these technologies, developed and deployed in time and in sufficient quantity, might have significantly altered the balance of the air war or the undersea war. But the development and deployment of German wonder weapons was plagued by exactly the same strategic incoherence and personal interference from Hitler that had characterized every other aspect of German war-making. The Me-262 jet fighter is perhaps the most instructive case. The aircraft was essentially ready for production by 1943, and the Luftwaffe's fighter commanders immediately recognized its potential to transform the air war. A fleet of Me-262s operating as pure interceptors could have inflicted catastrophic losses on the Allied bomber formations that were methodically destroying Germany's industrial base. They were faster than any Allied fighter escort, could climb rapidly to altitude, and were armed with 4 30mm cannon whose firepower was devastating. In the hands of experienced pilots, the Me-262 was genuinely revolutionary. But Hitler, in a decision that stunned his Air Force commanders, insisted that the Me-262 be developed and deployed primarily as a fast bomber, a blitz bomber, rather than as an interceptor. His reasoning was characteristically perverse. He believed Germany needed to go on the offensive against Allied cities and supply lines in the West, rather than purely defending German airspace. When asked whether the Me-262 could carry bombs, and told that, with some modification it could, he exploded with enthusiasm and declared it the fast bomber he had always wanted. The result was months of delay, modifications that degraded the aircraft's performance, and the deployment of a fraction of the interceptors that might have been available. Germany ultimately produced only about 1,400 Me-262s, of which perhaps 300 were actually flown in combat, and only a minority of those were ever used in the interceptor role for which they were best suited. Had Germany deployed the Me-262 as an interceptor in 1943 rather than 1944, the results might have been dramatically different. The V-weapons program suffered from a different but equally characteristic problem: resources lavished on weapons that consumed enormous quantities of labor, material, and scientific talent, while delivering strategic effects that were ultimately negligible. The V-1 and V-2 attacks on Britain caused significant civilian casualties and considerable psychological effect, but they did not bring Britain close to surrender, could not be targeted with sufficient precision to destroy industrial or military targets, and consumed resources that might have been used to produce more tactically useful weapons. The decision to prioritize the V-weapons over, for example, expanded production of the Type 21 submarine or larger numbers of Me-262 interceptors reflected a recurring pattern in Hitler's technological decision-making. He was attracted to weapons with dramatic, visible impact, to vengeance weapons that matched his own emotional needs, rather than to the unglamorous but decisive weapons that actually determined the outcome of battles. The result was that Germany spent its diminishing industrial capacity on weapons that achieved little while neglecting technologies that might have made a genuine difference. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and one of the Third Reich's most able administrators, performed extraordinary feats of industrial organization between 1942 and 1945, sustaining and even briefly increasing German weapons production in the face of the Allied bombing campaign through dispersal of factories, rationalization of production processes, and the ruthless exploitation of forced labor from concentration camps and occupied territories. After the war, Speer was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, where he remained until his release in 1966, claiming throughout that he had been unaware of the Holocaust, a claim that most historians now consider to be at best a carefully constructed legal defense and at worst an outright fabrication. His son, Albert Speer Jr., born in July 1934, grew up to be an architect, determinedly separating his career from his father's legacy. In an interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung, he said, "I have tried my whole life to separate myself from my father, to distance myself." He passed away at his Frankfurt residence in 2017. The Holocaust itself, which was not a strategic blunder in the narrow military sense, but which deserves consideration in any account of how the Third Reich destroyed itself, consumed enormous resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The transportation network required to move millions of people to the death camps, the administrative apparatus required to manage the genocide, the manpower required to staff the camps and carry out the killings, all of these represented a diversion of Germany's shrinking resources away from the military. Effort at precisely the time when those resources were most urgently needed. More fundamentally, the Holocaust and the other systematic mass murder programs, including the murder of Soviet prisoners of war, the deliberate starvation of occupied populations, and the brutal repression of partisan resistance movements, ensured that Germany's occupied territories were never a reliable economic base that could be extracted through relatively voluntary cooperation. Resistance movements flourished throughout occupied Europe precisely because the Nazi occupation regime was so brutal that collaboration offered neither safety nor dignity. The Barbarossa Decree, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and the harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, the transmission of which was one of the charges for which Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb was tried at the High Command trial, turned potentially willing anti-Soviet populations in the Baltic states and Ukraine into enemies of Germany through the sheer brutality of German occupation policies. There were genuinely large numbers of Soviet citizens who, at the outset of Barbarossa, regarded the Germans as liberators from Stalinist tyranny. That sentiment was squandered within weeks by the murderous behavior of SS Einsatzgruppen, the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and the wholesale looting of occupied territories. The Commissar Order, issued in conjunction with the start of Barbarossa, was one of the most self-defeating documents ever produced by a military high command. It ordered the immediate execution, upon capture, of all Soviet political commissars, the Communist Party officials embedded with Red Army units. The order achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than demoralizing Soviet forces by eliminating their political backbone, it gave Soviet soldiers a powerful incentive never to surrender, knowing that capture meant death. It extended this logic to every Soviet officer and soldier who might fear being identified as politically suspect. The result was that Soviet forces fought with a ferocity that reflected not only patriotism and genuine conviction, but also the knowledge that surrender offered no escape. The Barbarossa Decree and the Commissar Order transformed a war that might have been fought as a relatively conventional military conflict, brutal enough in all conscience, into a war of ideological extermination in which the normal rules of warfare had been suspended, and in doing so, they helped to create the conditions for Germany's eventual defeat by ensuring that no accommodation with the Soviet population was ever possible. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, who commanded Army Group A during the Balkan Campaign in 1941 and later during the Caucasus Offensive of 1942, was tried in the American hostages trial for war crimes committed by German forces under his command in the Balkans, including brutal reprisals against civilians and partisan operations. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1948, released in 1953 due to ill health, and lived until 1971, dying at the age of 91. His case exemplifies the broader truth about German occupation policies, that the men who executed them, even those who may not have personally issued the most criminal orders, bore a degree of command responsibility for atrocities that made any neat distinction between honourable soldier and war criminal essentially impossible to sustain. The hostages trial took its name from the practice of taking civilian hostages and executing them as reprisals for partisan attacks, a practice that was common across German-occupied Europe and that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in Yugoslavia, Greece, France, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. These were not the random crimes of individual soldiers acting without orders. They were systematic policies authorized and transmitted through the command chain. The question of accountability and the complexities of post-war justice occupied Germany and the world for decades, At the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 and concluded in October 1946, 22 major war criminals were tried before the International Military Tribunal. 11 were sentenced to death and hanged, including Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, whose final words as he mounted the gallows were "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," meaning "I salute you, my eternal Germany," and General Alfred Jodl, who had served as the Wehrmacht's operational chief throughout the war and who had signed the Commando Order and the Commissar Order, justifying the former by claiming that Allied commandos had violated the laws of war and therefore forfeited their protections. 7 were sentenced to terms of imprisonment ranging from 10 years to life, including Karl Dönitz, who received 10 years for his role in the Atlantic U-boat campaign, and Rudolf Hess, who received life imprisonment and remained in Spandau. Prison until his death at 93 in 1987, the prison's last remaining inmate. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, known as the subsequent Nuremberg trials, or the Nuremberg military tribunals, tried more than 180 defendants in 12 separate proceedings that addressed specific categories of war criminals: SS officers, doctors who had conducted medical experiments on prisoners, judges who had administered Nazi law, industrialists who had used slave labor, and the military commanders who had transmitted and executed criminal orders. The High Command trial, in particular, addressed the responsibility of senior Wehrmacht officers for war crimes in the Soviet Union and the Balkans, convicting 14 defendants and acquitting 2. The sentences handed down ranged from time served to life imprisonment, though most were reduced or commuted in subsequent years as Cold War politics made West Germany a valuable ally and the Western powers became reluctant to maintain the moral pressure of the trials. Georg von Küchler's sentence was reduced from 20 years to 12 years in 1951 before his release in February 1953. Wilhelm List was released in 1953. Even Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had been sentenced to death by a British military court for ordering the Ardiertyne Cave massacre, had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment and was released in 1952 on health grounds, subsequently becoming active in veterans organisations and writing his memoirs. The pattern of early releases reflected both genuine concerns about ageing defendants whose health was deteriorating and a broader political calculation that the purpose of the trials, to establish the principle of individual accountability for war crimes and to begin a process of German confrontation with its recent past, had been at least partially served by the trials themselves, regardless of whether the sentences were actually served, whether this calculation was correct, whether justice was adequately served remains disputed to this day. For the survivors of the Holocaust, the slave labourers, and the populations of the occupied territories where German forces had committed their worst atrocities, the early releases of men who had commanded the forces responsible for mass murder were a source of lasting anguish and a reminder that the scales of justice had been measured differently for perpetrators and victims. The post-war fates of the children and wives of Nazi leaders tell another dimension of this story with remarkable human complexity. Gudrun Himmler, born on August 8, 1929, was the only child of Heinrich Himmler, the man who had more than almost any other individual been the architect of the Holocaust's machinery. She remained a devoted supporter of her father's memory until her death in 2018, insisting that he had been assassinated rather than having bitten on a cyanide capsule, working for an organisation called Stille Hilfe, the Silent Aid Society, which provided support to arrested, condemned and fugitive former SS members. Her father had called her Puppy and had flown her to his Berlin offices for visits. She had attended official functions on his arm. After the war, she and her mother were held in camps in Italy, France and Germany and were summoned to Nuremberg to testify. Released in November 1946, she spent the rest of her life in a kind of perpetual denial, refusing to acknowledge what her father had done, what the organisation he had built had done to millions of human beings. Her loyalty was, in its own terms, remarkable. Her blindness to the reality of Himmler's crimes was total. Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, presented a similarly complex case. She had met Hess in the early 1920s, had introduced him to Adolf Hitler, and had been one of the first women to join the Nazi Party. When Hess flew to Scotland in May 1941 on his extraordinary solo peace mission, she was left to manage the fallout at home, a wife abandoned, by a husband whose grand gesture had achieved nothing and destroyed his standing in the regime. Hitler had Hess publicly declared insane. Ilse spent the war years defending her husband's intentions. After the war, she was arrested and interned at Augsburg, then released. She opened a boarding house in Allgäu, supported Stille Hilfe, and wrote a controversial memoir. She spent decades campaigning for Hess's release from Spandau prison, where he was held until his death in 1987. She passed away on September 7, 1995, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the man she had devoted her life to defending. Their son, Wolf Hess, who had campaigned tirelessly for his father's freedom and had established the committee to free Rudolf Hess, with hundreds of thousands of supporters, died in 2001, still insisting that his father had been a man of peace rather than a war criminal. Margarete Himmler, the wife of the Reichsführer SS, presents yet another variation on the theme of Nazi women's post-war experience. She had joined the Nazi Party in 1928 and had arranged social gatherings for the wives of high-ranking SS leaders. In her diary, she recorded a visit to German-occupied Poland in March 1940, with the casual contempt for Jewish and Polish populations that characterized the ideology she had absorbed. Yet, when the war ended and her husband's crimes became fully known, she portrayed herself as an innocent, claiming ignorance of the Holocaust and pleading to be cleared of Nazi association. In 1953, she was found to be a profiteer of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days of penal labour, stripped of her voting rights and pension eligibility. She lived under a false name until her death in 1967, trying to distance herself from a past that could not be escaped. Emmy Göring, wife of the Luftwaffe chief, was found guilty by a German denazification court of being a Nazi, incarcerated for a year, had a portion of her wealth seized, and was prohibited from performing on stage for 5 years. She had called herself the First Lady of the Third Reich, had feuded with Eva Braun over precedence, and had enjoyed a life of extraordinary luxury funded by her husband's looting of artworks and estates from Jewish families and others. After her release, she lived quietly in a small Munich apartment and wrote an autobiography. She died in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. Edda Göring, the only child of Hermann Göring and his second wife Emmy Sonnemann, had been born to extraordinary privilege, receiving historic artworks as gifts and growing up at Karenhall, the vast Göring family estate. When her father was sentenced to death at Nuremberg, only to escape execution by committing suicide on October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled hanging, Edda's world collapsed. She spent the rest of her life attempting to live quietly, rarely speaking publicly about her father, maintaining in private that he had been a good man while losing long legal battles over the artworks seized from Jewish families that had formed part of her childhood wealth. She died in 2018, the last surviving child of a major Nazi leader, having navigated 90 years of life under the shadow of her father's crimes. Rolf Mengele, son of the infamous Auschwitz doctor Josef Mengele, grew up in Germany unaware of his father's crimes in the death camps, believing him to have been a war hero. He learned the truth as a teenager. In 1977, he travelled to South America to meet his father, who was living in Brazil under an assumed identity. His father expressed no guilt and attempted to justify his experiments. Rolf, though he despised what his father had done, kept silent about his location. Josef Mengele died in 1979 when he drowned while swimming at a Brazilian beach. Rolf, unable to betray even a father he despised, carried this burden for the rest of his life, eventually changing his name and retiring from a career as a corporate lawyer to lead what is described as a tranquil existence in Germany. These personal stories, as moving and complex as they are, ultimately connect back to the military and strategic story of the blunders that destroyed the Third Reich. Because one of the deepest ironies of Hitler's leadership was that the ideology that drove the most terrible aspects of his regime was not separate from his military strategy, but was woven into it at every level. The Commissar Order was not simply a war crime, it was a strategic mistake that made Germany's war in the East harder to win. The Holocaust was not simply a moral catastrophe, it was also a diversion of resources and a generator of resistance that made German occupation of Europe more costly and less sustainable. The ideology that declared certain populations subhuman and therefore dispensable determined not only what was done to the victims, but what was done to Germany itself. It destroyed potential allies, alienated populations that might have cooperated, and ensured that Germany's enemies would fight with a ferocity that a less existentially threatening invasion might not have generated. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, all of Hitler's blunders had accumulated into an irreversible catastrophe. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and were advancing rapidly into the heart of Germany. In Italy, German forces were in full retreat. In the air, Germany had effectively lost the ability to contest Allied air superiority. On the seas, the U-boat campaign that had once threatened to strangle Britain had been decisively defeated. The surviving submarines were surrendering in harbours from Scotland to Norway, and Operation Deadlight was being planned to sink them in the North Atlantic. The Waffen-SS divisions that had been Hitler's elite, feared on every front from the Arctic to the Aegean, were being hunted by Allied forces, their members facing trial, imprisonment, or flight. The men of the Leibstandarte. Adolf Hitler and Das Reich and the other famous SS divisions were, by the spring of 1945, either prisoners, casualties, or desperately looking for a way out of a war that had been lost years earlier by the man they had sworn to serve with their lives. The final weeks of Hitler's war make for some of the most extraordinary reading in all of military history, not for the brilliance of the operations, which were non-existent, but for the sheer unreality of the atmosphere in the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, where Hitler spent the last days of his life issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counterattacks by divisions that had been destroyed, raging at generals who had failed him, and retreating ever further from any contact with the catastrophic reality that had resulted from his own decisions. On April 16, 1945, the final Soviet assault on Berlin began when Marshal Zhukov's forces crossed the Oder River and began their advance on the German capital. By April 25th, Berlin was surrounded. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting in the streets barely a kilometre from the bunker, Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, having first taken a cyanide capsule to ensure the result. Eva Braun, whom he had married in a brief ceremony the night before, took cyanide alongside him. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery garden as Hitler had requested, to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. In the days that followed, Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named in his will as his successor, tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies that would allow Germany to continue fighting in the East, a final attempt to exploit the tensions within the Allied coalition that Hitler had predicted would save Germany. The Western Allies refused. On May 7, 1945, at Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces. It took effect on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The Flensburg government, which Dönitz had assembled in the final days of the Reich, was dissolved by the Allies on May 23, 1945, and Dönitz was arrested. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace and war crimes, acquitted of crimes against humanity, and sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison. Released in 1956, he relocated to a small town near Hamburg and published his autobiography in 1958, insisting that he had had no knowledge of Hitler's crimes. He died in 1980. Field Marshal Keitel, who had been captured by the British in May 1945 and who, unlike most of his colleagues, explicitly accepted responsibility for the criminal orders he had issued, was hanged at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946. His final words were a salute to his eternal Germany. Field Marshal Albert Jodl was hanged the same day. Manstein was imprisoned until 1953 when he was released due to health issues. He later served as an advisor to the West German government on army organization, published memoirs titled Wöllerain's Siege, which became one of the most widely read accounts of the war from the German perspective, and died in 1973. The question of what might have been had Hitler made different choices is, of course, ultimately unanswerable, and there is a real danger in counterfactual reasoning that seems to suggest the war could have been won by a more rational German leadership. The Allied coalition, with the industrial and human resources of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined, represented an overwhelming weight of power against which even the most brilliant German strategy would have faced enormous difficulties. But the point is not that Germany could necessarily have won, but that Hitler's specific blunders shortened the possible duration of German strategic viability by years and made final catastrophe more complete than it needed to be. A Germany that had captured Dunkirk's army might, have made a negotiated peace possible in 1940, a Germany that had maintained air superiority over Britain rather than pivoting to the Blitz might have forced a political settlement. A Germany that had not declared war on the United States might have contained American participation in the European theatre indefinitely. A Germany that had accepted professional military advice at Stalingrad might have preserved the Sixth Army. Each of these alternative paths led away from the particular kind of total, catastrophic, unconditional defeat that actually occurred. The aftermath of the Third Reich's collapse left a shattered continent and raised questions about accountability, justice, and historical memory that remain unresolved even today, 80 years after the end of the war. The men who had served Hitler, who had executed his blunders and his crimes, faced wildly varying fates depending on who captured them, where they were tried, how effectively they could construct a defense, and what the political climate in the immediate post-war period demanded. Understanding these fates and the complexity of assigning responsibility across a command structure in which criminal orders were transmitted through layers of bureaucracy and military hierarchy requires a careful examination of individuals whose stories refuse to fit neat moral categories. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the elderly Prussian aristocrat who had been recalled from retirement at the beginning of the war and who had served Germany in command roles from the invasion of Poland through the final months of the Western Front, captured by American forces on May 1, 1945, the day after Hitler's death, suffered a heart attack during his initial interrogation. He was charged by the British with war crimes related to his assistance in transmitting von Reichenau's notorious Severity Order, which had authorized mass killings in occupied Soviet territory. Due to his advanced age and deteriorating health, he was never put on trial and was released in July 1948. He spent his retirement in Schloss Oppershausen in Lower Saxony, where he died on February 24, 1953, the old soldier who had famously told Keitel, "Make peace, you fools," having lived long enough to see Germany not just make peace, but begin the process of rebuilding itself into a democratic state. His case exemplifies the compromises that the post-war justice system was forced to make between the demands of historical accountability and the practical realities of prosecuting elderly, infirm defendants whose trials might produce only a few months of additional imprisonment before death. The story of Germany's military leadership after the war cannot be told without addressing the fundamental question of whether and how the Wehrmacht was complicit in Nazi crimes. For decades after the war, a powerful myth known as the Clean Wehrmacht held that the German regular army had fought a conventional military war, according to the laws of war, and that responsibility for atrocities rested exclusively with the SS and with special Nazi formations that were ideologically motivated in ways that the professional military was not. This myth was assiduously cultivated by surviving veterans organizations, by the memoirs of former commanders, and by a West German political establishment that had every incentive to allow its citizens to identify with the millions of ordinary soldiers who had fought in the Wehrmacht, rather than with the comparatively small number of SS perpetrators. Erich von Manstein's memoirs, for example, discussed his operational brilliance at length while being carefully evasive about his order's contributions to the terrible treatment of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war in his area of command. The Clean Wehrmacht myth began to unravel gradually through the 1960s and 1970s as historical scholarship examined the documentary record more carefully, and it was finally demolished in 1995 by the Crimes of the Shi'i Wehrmacht exhibition organized by the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, which presented photographic and documentary evidence of Wehrmacht participation in mass killings, the execution of prisoners, and the deliberate starvation of civilian populations across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union. The exhibition caused enormous controversy in Germany, including bomb threats and protests from veterans organizations, some of which had been founded by the same HIAG network that had defended the Waffen-SS as an apolitical fighting force. A revised version of the exhibition, incorporating corrections to some specific errors in the original, was presented from 2001 to 2004 and drew millions of visitors. The process of German reckoning with the Wehrmacht's actual role in Nazi crimes, as opposed to the idealized image of the honorable professional soldier fighting a conventional military war, took another generation to advance significantly beyond what the Nuremberg trials had established. The Waffen-SS veterans who survived the war and the post-war trials had constructed, through HIAG and through the prolific publication of divisional histories and memoirs, a carefully curated version of their wartime service that emphasized military professionalism, unit cohesion, and the nobility of soldiers doing their duty while systematically minimizing or omitting the war crimes that Waffen-SS formations had committed across Europe. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, formed from members of the Hitler Youth, had massacred Canadian prisoners at Normandy in 1944. Its commander, SS Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer, was tried and imprisoned for this atrocity. The Das Reich Division had destroyed the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France on June 10, 1944, killing 642 civilians in reprisal for partisan activity. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the original SS division that had been Hitler's personal bodyguard, was implicated in the Malmedy massacre of American prisoners during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. These were not the acts of rogue elements acting without orders. They were systematic, and they reflected an organizational culture in which the murder of civilians and prisoners was normalized as a tool of military occupation and terror. The denazification process that followed the war sorted former Nazis and their collaborators into 5 categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. For former Waffen-SS men, the verdicts depended heavily on rank, the specific units they had served in, and the particular circumstances of their service. The vast majority of lower-ranking soldiers were classified as followers or lesser offenders and released within months of the war's end, often with no meaningful consequences beyond a temporary loss of civil rights. The practical impossibility of trying hundreds of thousands of individuals individually, combined with the Cold War logic that made West Germany a necessary ally against the Soviet threat rather than a subject of continued moral scrutiny, meant that most former Waffen-SS soldiers returned to civilian life and rebuilt careers, families, and identities that, in most cases, excluded any serious engagement with the crimes of the organization they had served. By September 1956, when West Germany's newly formed Bundeswehr was accepting applications from former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS veterans, only 508 of the 3,117 Waffen-SS applicants were approved for service. The rest were rejected, but that still left the majority of former SS soldiers as free civilians in a country that was becoming one of the most prosperous in Western Europe. The organization called HIAG, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, which had been founded in 1951 by former SS generals Paul Hauser, Otto Kumm, and Felix Steiner, represented the organized face of this community's determination to rehabilitate its historical reputation. HIAG published the magazine Der Freiwillige and financed the publication of memoirs and divisional histories that portrayed the Waffen-SS as elite soldiers who had fought honorably in a legitimate military role. Paul Hauser's 1953 book Soldaten wie andere auch, meaning soldiers like any other, became the foundational text of this revisionist effort, arguing that the Waffen-SS had been an apolitical fighting force comparable in all essential respects to any other military unit. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's public declaration in 1953 that Waffen-SS men had fought as soldiers just like others gave this narrative official political cover and reflected the calculations of a pragmatic conservative politician who needed the votes of millions of veterans and their families more than he needed historical accuracy. HIAG's influence peaked in the 1960s when its lobbying helped secure pension rights for former Waffen-SS members under the Federal War Victims Relief Act, and when commemorative events for SS divisions were covered by local media without significant criticism. The shift came with Germany's changing political culture in the late 1960s and 1970s, when a new generation began to ask harder questions about the recent past. Student activists, journalists, and a new wave of historians began to examine the gap between the carefully constructed HIAG narrative and the documentary record of what Waffen-SS units had actually done. A Der Spiegel investigation in 1978 exposed HIAG's political connections and its efforts to manipulate pension legislation in ways that benefited former SS members while doing nothing for their victims. The scandal accelerated the organization's decline. By the 1980s, HIAG was fighting mostly local battles over memorial plaques and cemetery inscriptions. In 1992, facing dwindling membership and public disapproval, it officially dissolved. But the questions HIAG had posed about how to balance individual soldiers' service against their organization's crimes, about what responsibility flows from membership in a declared criminal organization, about the distinction between fighting in a war and participating in genocide, were not resolved by HIAG's dissolution. They continued to surface in new forms as Germany and Europe confronted the legacies of the Second World War. In the Baltic states, former members of locally recruited Waffen-SS divisions were increasingly commemorated after the fall of communism as national heroes who had fought against Soviet occupation, regardless of the means they had used or the organization they had served. Annual marches in Riga, honouring the 15th and 19th Latvian SS divisions, drew sharp criticism from Jewish organisations and the European Parliament, who argued that honouring men who had served in the Waffen-SS was incompatible with European values. The counter-argument that these men had fought primarily against Soviet occupation rather than for Nazi ideology was precisely the argument that HIAG had been making about Germans for 40 years, with considerably less historical evidence behind it, given that the Baltic formations had been created much later in the war and had served in more clearly ideological contexts than many of the original German Waffen-SS divisions. Germany, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, confronted its wartime past with greater openness than had been possible during the Cold War period, when the political imperatives of Western alliance against the Soviet Union had created strong incentives to minimize German guilt and to rehabilitate German institutions. Newly opened archives in both East and West, combined with the testimony of survivors whose accounts could now be heard without the political filters of the Cold War, revealed the full scope of German participation in the crimes of the Nazi regime across all institutional sectors, including the Wehrmacht, the SS, the civil administration, the judiciary, the churches, the corporations, and the individual soldiers and officials who had carried out orders they knew to be criminal. The Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, opened in 1993, and the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, opened in 2005, became symbols of a determined commitment to ensure that the crimes of the Third Reich were neither forgotten nor relativized. Yet even in this environment of greater historical honesty, the specific blunders that had led to Germany's military defeat received less attention than the crimes that had accompanied it. Hitler's strategic mistakes were discussed primarily in military history, which had always attracted a large popular audience fascinated by the operational and tactical aspects of the war, without always connecting these operational failures to the deeper ideological and structural problems that caused them. The dismissal of professional military advice, the personal command of armies by an untrained amateur, the substitution of ideological conviction for logistical calculation, the delusional belief that one could substitute for resources, these were not separate from the Holocaust and the other crimes of the Nazi state. They were products of the same fundamental pathology, the belief that one man's vision, unconstrained by the normal limitations of human knowledge, institutional accountability, or moral restraint, could determine the outcome of history. The specific blunders we have examined throughout this account, from the halt order at Dunkirk through the Battle of Britain miscalculation, the invasion of the Soviet Union without adequate preparation, the failure to capture Moscow in 1941, the declaration of war on the United States, the disaster at Stalingrad, the delay and defeat at Kursk, the mishandling of the Normandy defences, the Ardennes gamble, and the technological failures that left Germany's most promising weapon systems underdeveloped until it was too late, all of them trace back to a single fundamental problem: the concentration of all decision-making power in the hands of one man whose judgment was catastrophically flawed, whose ideology prevented him from accurately assessing the nature and capabilities of his enemies, and whose psychology made him incapable of acknowledging failure or accepting advice that contradicted his convictions. Albert Kesselring, who had been one of Germany's most versatile commanders, serving in the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, and then as commander in the Mediterranean theatre, before assuming command in the West in the final months of the war, reflected after his release from prison on the strange duality of his experience. A professional soldier of genuine ability and considerable personal charm, remembered by his troops as Smiling Albert, who had also ordered the massacre of 335 Italian civilians in reprisal for a partisan attack. The Ardeatine Caves massacre remains one of the most notorious German atrocities in Italy, and the fact that Kesselring ordered it as a standard reprisal measure, in accordance with the military logic of occupation warfare that German commanders had applied across Europe, illustrates how thoroughly the criminal framework of Nazi military occupation had been normalized within the German command culture. Kesselring did not see himself as a mass murderer. He saw himself as a soldier doing his duty according to the rules of counterinsurgency warfare as the Nazi state had defined them. That this self-perception was delusional does not make it less revealing of how an entire institutional culture had been corrupted. The families of those executed in the Ardeatine caves, like the families of the victims of every German atrocity, from the mass shootings of Babi Yar in September 1941, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in 2 days, to the destruction of Warsaw and the deliberate starvation policies in Leningrad and other Soviet cities lived with the consequences of German military policy long after the soldiers who had implemented it had been released from prison and returned to their homes. The asymmetry between the suffering inflicted and the punishment received was, and remains, a source of profound moral discomfort that no amount of subsequent German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, can entirely resolve. What remains 8 decades later is a story with multiple layers of meaning and significance. At the most immediate level, it is a military history of catastrophic strategic mistakes made by a dictator who trusted his instincts over his experts' advice and paid the ultimate price in national disaster. At a deeper level, it is an institutional story about what happens when professional accountability is destroyed and replaced by personal loyalty to a charismatic leader, when the institutions designed to check individual error are systematically dismantled, and when the culture of an entire military command is corrupted by the ideology of the state it serves. At the deepest level of all, it is a human story about the consequences of ideology untempered by reality, about the gap between the world as a powerful man imagines it and the world as it actually is, and about the cost paid not by the man whose delusions drive the catastrophe, but by the millions of ordinary people, soldiers and civilians alike, on all sides of the conflict, whose lives were shattered by it. The generals whose careers and fates we have traced throughout this account, Brauchitsch and Rundstedt, Lieb and Kuchler, Kleist and List, Kesselring and Manstein, Keitel and Jodl and Dönitz, were men of formidable professional ability who served a criminal regime and paid varying prices for doing so. Some were executed, some imprisoned, some released after short terms, some lived to old age in the country their decisions had helped to destroy and rebuild. Their tactical and operational brilliance, real as it was, could not compensate for the strategic catastrophe that Hitler's blunders had created, any more than the courage and endurance of the soldiers who fought under their command could substitute for the logistics, the manpower, and the strategic coherence that Hitler's decisions had squandered. The Third Reich did not fail because the German army fought badly. It failed because the man at the top made decision after decision that destroyed the strategic conditions under which even the finest army in the world could have prevailed. The U-boats that had once haunted Allied shipping lanes lay at the bottom of the North Atlantic, sunk under Operation Deadlight between November 1945 and February 1946. A handful survived as museum ships, among them U-995 at Lebu, near Kiel, where visitors can still squeeze through the narrow hatches and experience the claustrophobic world in which German submariners had lived and died, and U-505 captured intact in June 1944, and now on permanent display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The Waffen-SS veterans were scattered, some tried, some imprisoned, some fled to South America or the Middle East, along escape networks that subsequent investigation revealed to be real and organized, and some quietly reintegrated into German civil society under the protective cover of the official silence that characterized the 1950s. The children of the Nazi leaders carried their fathers' legacies in very different ways. Martin Bormann, Jr., converted to Catholicism and sought atonement in missionary work. Nicholas Frank wrote books denouncing his father, the Butcher of Poland, with a ferocity born of genuine moral reckoning. Albert Speer, Jr., simply refused to discuss his father and built a separate career and identity. Wolf Hess defended his father until he died in 2001. All of these individual stories, as different as they are, circle back to the same center. A man who rose from obscurity to total Power through the exploitation of a nation's grievances and fears, who used that power to construct a system of conquest and murder on a scale the world had never seen, and whose catastrophic strategic blunders ultimately ensured that the system he had built collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and the combined military power of a world that had finally united against him. The cracks in the Third Reich had begun at Dunkirk in the summer of 1940, when 300,000 men escaped to fight another day. They had widened with the Battle of Britain, with the failure before Moscow, with the declaration of war on America, with the catastrophe of Stalingrad. By 1944 and 1945, the cracks had become chasms, and the Third Reich fell into them, leaving behind nothing but ruins, guilt, and the long, painful work of understanding how it happened and ensuring it never happens again. The story of Hitler's biggest blunders is, ultimately, the story of what happens when a nation allows absolute power to concentrate in the hands of a single individual who believes himself answerable to no one and infallible in his judgments. The professional soldiers who served under him knew, many of them from very early on, that the strategy was catastrophically flawed. Halder wrote it in his diary in July 1941. Rundstedt said it to Keitel's face in July 1944. Manstein argued it in operational briefing after operational briefing, patiently, carefully, and entirely in vain. Guderian raged against the misuse of his armoured forces in battle after battle across 2 continents and 3 years of war. None of it mattered, because in the Third Reich, the one voice that counted was Hitler's, and Hitler's voice, by the end, had lost all contact with military reality. The blunders were not accidental, they were structural. They were the inevitable product of a system designed to concentrate all power and all judgment in the hands of one man, and that man happened to be catastrophically wrong about nearly everything that mattered. In the ruins of 1945, as the Third Reich died around its creator, the men who had served it began to construct the narratives that would define how Germany and the world remembered it. Some, like Keitel, accepted responsibility. Most did not. The Nuremberg trials established the legal precedent that individuals are responsible for their actions even when those actions are carried out under orders, a principle that had to fight against centuries of military culture to win acceptance, and that is still contested today in debates about the limits of obedience and the nature of command responsibility. The trials also established, however imperfectly, a record, a documented account of what had happened, who had ordered it, who had carried it out, and what the consequences had been. That record, supplemented by decades of subsequent historical scholarship and by the testimony of survivors, forms the foundation of our understanding of the Second World War and of the Nazi regime that caused it, and that understanding matters, not merely as an exercise in historical interest, but as a continuing moral and political imperative. The particular blunders that destroyed the Third Reich were not random errors that could have been made by any leader in any context. They were products of specific pathologies, the pathology of ideology over reality, of personal vanity over institutional accountability, of racial theory over military logic, of will over supply, of hatred over calculation. These pathologies are not unique to Hitler or to Germany. They recur in varying forms and at varying scales whenever power is concentrated without accountability, when institutions designed to check error are dismantled, and when the gap between a leader's vision and reality is allowed to grow unchallenged until it becomes irreparable. The story of Hitler's blunders is, in this sense, not merely a historical curiosity. It is a warning that the cracks which appear in any structure built on false foundations will, eventually and inevitably, bring it down. Well, that is it for today's video. We hope you found this deep exploration of Hitler's biggest strategic blunders not only informative, but genuinely illuminating about how one man's catastrophic failures in judgment shaped the entire course of the Second World War and its aftermath. From the fateful halt order at Dunkirk that let 300,000 Allied troops escape to fight again, to the mishandling of the Battle of Britain, the catastrophic invasion of the Soviet Union without adequate preparation, the self-destructive declaration of war on the United States, the disaster at Stalingrad, the delayed and failed Kursk offensive, the squandered opportunities of new technology, and the final hopeless gamble of the Ardennes offensive, we have traced the fault lines that ran through the Third Reich from its earliest apparent triumphs to its inevitable and complete destruction. The men who served Hitler, The field marshals and generals whose careers we have examined were, in many cases, military professionals of genuine ability who had the misfortune of serving a leader whose ego, ideology, and contempt for professional military advice brought catastrophe not only to the Reich, but to the world. Their fates after the war, varying from execution to imprisonment to early release to quiet retirement, tell us something important about how societies struggle with the question of accountability when the crimes of the past are also the crimes of individuals who were once powerful and celebrated. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our other videos on what happened to Germany's top field marshals and generals after World War II, the fate of the German U-boats after the war, where the Waffen-SS went after 1945, and what became of the children of Nazi leaders. There is a whole world of history to explore, and every story connects to every other story in ways that illuminate something important about how the most destructive war in human history was fought, lost, and remembered. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more content just like this. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.